Hey everybody, welcome back to part 4 of the Getting Started tutorial mini-series for the composition framework. I've already shown you how to do some game logic, make some user interface stuff, explained variables, expressions, and now we're going to combine all that into a kind of multi-scene setup resembling a slightly more legitimate game. We're going to do some scene transitions between those levels, and so let's get started. I've already kind of set this up so we can get it done a little bit faster. I've renamed our first scene to level 1. I've made a second level, which is almost identical to level 1. And I've moved all our UI stuff, like the message control and the canvas, all to its own scene as well. So let's go back to level 1. And what we want to do is we want to load an interface with these scenes through the graph. So the first thing we're going to do is in our start node on the player, or our start graph on the player, we're going to create a new node called a load scene node because we want the UI to be loaded at the start of the game. So we'll connect this just right to the beginning, and we're going to call this load UI, and we're going to, from this little drop down, pick our UI scene. Now this, all of the scenes that are in your build settings will appear in this list, so make sure all your scenes are added here. Sometimes I always forget to add my scenes to the build settings when I create them initially. So if they don't appear in there, that's probably why. And then we'll connect this back to our start message. And we want to wait for completion, and we do want it to be loaded additively. So we'll just see what this does, and we'll make sure that, hey, our UI is there when we start. Now you'll notice, if you watch that again, that it pauses for a bit at the beginning. And that is because the scene is loading while it's not showing this message until the scene is loaded. So usually in games, you want to obscure this kind of behind the scenes loading stuff. So we use transitions to do that. And a transition is basically, in the composition framework, it's just an asset that applies an effect to a camera with a shader. And I know it sounds a little complex, but I'll just show you how to. We have a couple transitions built in, and I can show you how to make them here. So we're going to create a new asset, a new folder, call this transitions, and we'll go create Pyrosoft transitions, and we'll just do a basic fade. We'll just call this fade. You can see it's got a couple properties over here. Duration is fine, and then this is the fade color. Now to play this transition, we want this to happen before we load our scene. So we're going to create a new node, and it'll be called play transition. So we'll just place it right before, and we'll call this obscure. So I called this obscure because each transition has 3 phases: an out, an obscure, and an in. So the out would be like a fade out. So it'd be if you like entered a trigger and are going to a new scene. Obscure is what you want when the actual loading is occurring, and in is when you're fading back into the new scene. So we're going to mark this as obscure. We're going to set the actual transition to our new asset that we created. And I'm going to uncheck auto finish because I don't want the transition to go away once that duration is done. We had set duration to 1, so I want this to stay around. I want it to continue rendering even after that duration is done. And I'll show you why in a second. Because we're going to create another node after our UI is done that's also a play transition. And this will be the actual fading in of, we'll call it fading in of the transition. So it'll be the same fade, and this phase will be in. Now this one we do want to auto finish. And we're not going to wait for completion because we want this message to show kind of before the transition is finished so that it's there while we're fading in on this screen. And I'll show you what that looks like. It's nothing. Wow, it was all black. Now I know the reason for that, and I'm going to tell you why, and it's because we don't have anything that's actually responding to our transitions. To do that, to each of our cameras, we have to add a component called a transition renderer. And all that does is it tells your camera that, hey, I want to be a part of the transition system. So what will happen, I'll show you here, if we add this, now our transition actually happened. But our UI didn't display until the very end, even though we had auto finish set to true. And so that means that the camera that was displaying the message was also not part of the transition renderer. So let's go into our UI, and we'll click on our camera, and we'll also add transition renderer to that. And now we'll save and go back to our level 1. Excuse me. Start it up, and now we'll see our message was there before the transition finished. We can play our game like normally. Perfect. So now we want to actually transition between levels. So let's create a new object that'll be like our finish line. And we'll just add a new sprite. We'll put it right in here. I think purple seems like a good color for a finish line. And we're going to add a box collider to it, make it a trigger. And just like our key in our door, we want some game logic to happen when we run into it. So we're going to add a collision graph trigger. And then we're going to create a new graph. And we'll just call this one, in our graphs folder, the finish graph. So now we can open up that graph. And a couple things we want to do when we finish. Let's disable our player. And the target is going to be, as you remember from the interface video, we have, since this is the actual finish object, not our context object, it is not the player, we have to reference the player as scene.player. Now this will get the actual game object of the player, but we actually want the player component. So we can just use an as keyword called player, and that's the name of the script that we wrote. So this is the actual player component on the player game object, and it will disable that. Let's show a message, and we'll just say finished, and then press enter to go to the next level. And we do want this to auto hide, and we want to wait for completion until we press enter. And the same thing for the other interfaces. We want this to say scene.message. We'll just call it finish message. And then after this, we want to load our next scene. So the first thing we're going to do, like we did before, we're going to do a transition, play transition. We're going to do the same asset from before. We'll call this fade out. So this will fade the screen to black. And we do want to wait for this one to complete, but we do not want this one to auto finish because we want it to stay around once it is done, because there will be some loading happening behind the scenes, which we'll do the same way with a load scene node. And we can specify our next scene, which will be level 2. Now the cool thing about this is we're going to want to finish on a level 2, or our level 2 finish line also, but we want to reuse this same graph. So instead of specifying this actual value of the scene, we can do it using a variable. So let's click variable, and just like we did with the interface that said input.level, and we specified the level name on the player, we can do the same thing here and say input.level, and that'll be the level to load. And since this one is loading a new scene and everything will start over, we don't want it to load additively because we want to get rid of this scene. And I always tend to have cleanup assets checked because if you're loading a new scene and you're having everything obscure, you might as well clean up all your data since the user won't even know the difference. And we'll just call this load next level. And now, if we go back into our player, we can see that the level is there. We know that, well, this is going to be a string, but I forgot to show you to go back into the inputs and say that we want this to be a string. And there, now we can specify it as a string here, and we are just going to specify the name of our level that we want to load. So it's called level 2. So level 2. And let's see what happens. And it will fade out. Press enter, grab our key, click this in, finished. Press enter to go to the next level. It'll fade out, and it'll start our second level. So it's all perfect. And we could do the same thing in that level 2 if we wanted. We could add a finish object, run the same finished graft, give it an input, and make as many levels as we wanted. So as always, pretty simple to do all that complex stuff, and you haven't even written a single line of code. So if you have any questions, like always, please feel free to ask us in Discord. You can check out our docs online, and we have one more video we're going to show you about some data binding, and so stay tuned. Thanks.